Welcome to the second part of my Sonic CD US soundtrack theory. In my last part, I have talked about how Stardust Speedway Past fits in with the US soundtrack, and now I'm going to talk about how Wacky Workbench Past fits in with the US soundtrack, including the US Wacky Workbench tracks themselves. This is where I'm going to start referencing parts of the album version of this soundtrack called Sonic the Hedgehog Boom. This is also where we are going to start hearing more about the vocals of the US soundtrack, which were originally done by a vocal group named Pastiche, which, funny enough, actually has the word past in their name. Anyway, let's start going through the music track of Wacky Workbench Past and compare it to the overall soundtrack. In the beginning of this track, you can hear a harmonica that is used throughout the track. The harmonica used in this track likely inspired the type of funky guitars that are used in such tracks as Wacky Workbench Present, Wacky Workbench Bad Future, and Stardust Speedway Good Future. Also starting in the beginning, you hear a repeating violin harmony that goes throughout the first half of the track. This violin could have inspired the choir that is used in both Wacky Workbench Present and Good Future. Subtly in the beginning of this track, you can hear a short repeating electronic melody that likely inspired the repeating electronic melodies in the Fourth Quadrant Future tracks and the special stage theme. This track also starts using the bass in the beginning, which has a very bouncy sound to it, like the bass that is used in such tracks as Tidal Tempest and Stardust Speedway Present. Generally throughout the track, it uses some electronic claps that likely inspire the type of drum beat that is used in the Fourth Quadrant Future tracks and Wacky Workbench Present. These electronic claps also might have inspired the snaps used in Metallic Madness' Good Future. Also, generally throughout the track, it uses an electronic drum beat that sounds like the electronic drum beat used throughout US Collision Chaos in the beginning of Tidal Tempest Present. The electronic drum beat together with the claps sound similar to the drum beat of quartz quadrant present. This track would then use a drum fill that is used to transition to each section of the track. These drum fills sound similar to the drum fills used in such tracks as Title Tempest's Good Future and Wacky Workbench Bad Future. Also following the drum fills, the track uses a cymbal bash, like the one used in Title Tempest Present. In this next section of the track, it actually uses a piano that follows the harmonica melody. This piano could actually inspire the vocals used in tracks such as Title Tempest Present and the album version of Quartz Quadrant Present. The piano melody would then change to a flute melody that could have inspired the brass melody used in Palm Tree Panic Bad Future. This section of the track is where you start to hear a cymbal beat throughout the rest of the track, which sounds like the cymbal beat used in the Quartz Quadrant Future tracks and the ending theme. In the next section of the track, it uses an electronic harmony that likely inspired the electronic harmony used in Quartz Quadrant Present, Stardust Speedway Good Future, and the Special Stage theme. Then after this section, it goes back to the same harmonica melody from before. Then it goes into a different section that uses an electronic melody similar to how Wacky Workbench Past Future uses one. This section also uses a brass harmony that could have inspired the brass that is used in such tracks as Palm Tree Panic Present, Stardust Speedway Present, and the Zone Clear theme. This section will then change pitch. Then it goes into one last section where the harmonica follows the bass before it loops. Now let's move on to comparing the US Wacky Workbench tracks to the past track, starting with the present theme. Starting in the beginning of this track, it uses a bass that sounds very similar to the bass that is used throughout most of the past track. Then after using an opening drum beat, it uses a funky guitar harmony that sounds like parts of the beginning harmonica harmony in the past track. This funky guitar harmony could also likely meant to be based on the first 5 notes of the harmonica melody that is used within the past track. This track also uses some repeating vocals that is likely an arrangement of the beginning harmonica harmony from the past track. The track then uses a brass melody that could likely be an arrangement of the opening bass of the past track. This brass melody could also be based on the brass harmony that is used in the second half of Wacky Workbench Past. In the album version of this track, it uses a Celeste melody that follows similar notes to parts of the bass from the past track. Then a minute into the track, it goes into the second half, where it uses a different funky guitar harmony that sounds more similar to the harmonica in the second half of the past track. The vocal was also changed to sound more like the harmonica harmony in the midsection of the past track. This bass used in this section also sounds like the general bass used in the past track. This second half then uses a choir that is likely meant to match the notes of the general bass from the past track. In the album version of this track, it uses a slow brass melody that is likely meant to be an arrangement of the flute melody from the past track. The track then loops back to the first half of it. Now let's move on to compare the Good Future track to the past track. This track starts with a drum beat, which then goes into a funky guitar melody that is likely meant to be an arrangement of the harmonica melody from the past track. You would also hear a choir that is used that could be based on the repeating violin used in the past track. bass used in this section sounds like an arrangement of the bass used in the beginning of the past track. Then before it transitions into the next section, the guitar uses the same melody that the beginning bass uses from the past track. Then in the second half, it uses a synth melody that could possibly be an arrangement of the flute melody from the past track. The section also uses an electric guitar harmony that is likely meant to be an arrangement of the electronic melody from the second half of Wacky Workbench Past. This section would then occasionally use a minor celeste melody that could be an arrangement of the harmonica harmonies in the past track. The track then goes back to the same funky guitar section as before, which leads to some solo construction sounds. But that is not it for this track, since there is a whole nother different section that is only in the album version of this track. This section starts after the guitar section with its chromatic electronic notes that could be based on the electronic harmony from the past track. This section uses a bass that sounds more like an arrangement of the general bass of the past track. This section would occasionally use an electronic melody that could be based on part of the bass from the past track. The section would then start to use a celeste melody that, like the electronic melody, could also be based on part of the bass from the past track. The track would then go back to the guitar section from before. Now let's move on to comparing the Bad Future track to the past track. This track uses a funky guitar harmony that is used throughout most of the track. This melody could be an arrangement of either the beginning bass or the brass harmony used in the past track. This track also uses a choir harmony that is probably meant to be based on the electronic harmony used in the midsection in the end of Wacky Workbench Past. There is also the bass, which sounds like an arrangement of the general bass used in the past track. The track would then start using an electronic melody that would slightly alter. This melody is likely meant to be an arrangement of the flute melody from the past track. Following the added melody, the track starts using some repeated vocals that are meant to match with the funky guitar. Then the track starts to change to having the guitar sound like one of the harmonica harmonies from the past track. This part also uses a vocal choir that is likely meant to sound like the repeating violin from the past track. The track would then go back to a similar section from before. Then it goes into a solo drum section, which in the album version of this track, it uses a bass that sounds like the same bass used in the beginning of the past track. Then it uses an electric guitar solo that goes into the next section. This guitar solo might be based on a mixture of the different harmonica harmonies used in the past track. Then the track goes back into the same choir section as before. And those were all the comparisons I have found between Wacky Workbench Past and the US soundtrack. Like I've said in the previous video, I hope anyone who watches through this video will share it around, even if you agree or disagree with my whole theory overall. I now have 5 parts left of this series since I am going to go through each of the past tracks. Anyway, I will see you in the next part.